Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. During his campaign, Donald Trump promised that on day one, he would bring down costs and make life more affordable for the American people. But has he been able to deliver on those promises? Pennsylvania Congressman Brendan Boyle is the ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee, and he joins us today to talk about the affordability crisis, holding the Trump administration accountable, and much more. Congressman, thank you for taking time to speak with us.
Yeah, good to be with you. It's a busy day here on Capitol Hill as Mike Johnson continues to mess up even more when it comes to daily life on Capitol Hill. So I'm with you for as long as I can be, but really happy to be here.
I appreciate that. Congressman, tell us what's going on Capitol Hill right now.
Yeah, so every day the schedule just gets changed constantly because Mike Johnson is always in a battle against his own members in order to get votes. And votes routinely are scheduled and then canceled and then brought back at midnight, as happened a couple weeks ago. He brought the vote back at midnight, lasted at 2 a.m., and he lost by 24. Yesterday's drama was over FISA extension and their reconciliation 2.0 bill, which I'm sure we'll get into. But aside from the substance, he had to keep it open for 5.5 hours because he had a couple dozen Republican members refusing to vote for it. And now we just walked off the House floor. It's supposed to leave for the week. And we are waiting to see if we're going to vote on ending the DHS shutdown, except for ICE and CBP, basically call up the bill that the Senate passed unanimously 4 weeks ago.
Right.
And that Mike Johnson said we would be voting on 4 weeks ago before he reneged on that commitment. And then there's also something called FISA, which we may or may not be voting on. So if you're getting confused in that, it's not you. It's a confusing, hectic situation because Republican leadership is so divided and lacks organization. So literally they make it up minute by minute.
So, Congressman, Republicans control everything in Washington. Donald Trump is president. They control both houses of Congress. Why does Mike Johnson not have control of his own chamber?
Yeah, and you can point to the small margins, right? They only have a few vote cushion. But guess what? Just 4 years ago, Democrats only had the same small majority that Republicans have now. And with that, Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, never lost a vote. We never went to the House floor unless we had enough votes to pass something. Now, basically every week, Speaker Johnson and House Republicans go to the floor, have a vote, and lose it. It's absolutely remarkable. One small thing on this, there's something called a rule, and I don't want eyes to glaze over if I get too much into the parliamentary weeds, but basically for the House to operate, you always need a rule on a vote. For 20 years, this was not paid attention to because, of course, the majority always carried the rule vote. It
Right.
hadn't lost in 20 years until the leadership of the House Republicans in this term. They have had a rule vote fail 5 times now, which is absolutely astounding when even one hadn't failed in 20 years. So that's just one sign of how incredibly dysfunctional the House of Representatives is right now under Republican misrule.
hmm Well, Congressman, I think that the American public is tired of things not working. They're tired of high gas prices, with inflation on the rise, with a lot of chaos coming out of the White House in Washington. We do have a critical midterm election coming up. So, if Democrats were to regain control of the House, how would things be different?
Well, I think back to the 2018 election when there was a Democratic wave. We won 40 seats. Democrats took back the House, didn't take back the Senate. And of course, we had Donald Trump going into the latter part of his term as president. I believe that come next year, it will be, as Yogi Berra once said, deja vu all over again. I think we're going to have a big Democratic election victory this November. I certainly think we're going to take back the House. We now have a realistic chance of taking back the Senate, which absolutely no one thought was possible 12
Mhm.
months ago. But regardless of how the Senate shakes out, I think that we are going to again have a situation in which Donald Trump is in the second half of his term as president, and we will have a Democratic House. And so, a lot like what we were able to do in 2019 and 2020, we will be able to provide a check against this presidency, which in so many ways is out of control. They are following the plan, the master plan that they had written a couple of years ago called Project 2025. They are in many ways much more extreme today than 8 years ago. And that's maybe where the analogy breaks down, because at least in Trump's first term, you had people like Milley and Kelly and Mattis who were trying to internally provide a check at the White House, in the West Wing. None of that exists today. You have the people who are the sycophants, who are frankly not very qualified and good at what they do, but they meet the one and only criterion, which is they are completely 100% beholden and obsequious to their dear leader, Trump, and will go along with absolutely anything he says, no matter how absurd it is.
You're the ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee, so you have had intimate dealings with the godfather of Project 2025, Russell Vought, who is, Trump's budget director. That's a fairly iconic picture. I think we have an exchange with you and with Russ Vought at the most recent hearing that you held on the budget.
Despite your rhetoric about this budget committee succeeding on deficit and debt, according to the Congressional Budget Office, as well as other nonpartisan groups, both left of center and right of center, have said that single piece of legislation adds more to our deficit and debt than any other piece of legislation passed by Congress in American history. In addition to the over $4 trillion it adds for our national debt, it eliminates health care coverage for more than 15 million Americans, according to the CBO. The Kaiser Family Foundation says there's actually more than 17 million Americans who will lose their health care. Are they really all, according to you? Really? You're going to sit here with a straight face and say they're all illegals, they were all defrauding the system? That's actually your position?
Yes.
As a member of Congress, how do you deal with an administration that constantly lies when you're trying to get basic information for the American people?
I think this is actually one of the fundamental questions of the last decade that many members of the media have grappled with as well. And frankly, I think a lot have failed on the job because we're used to the old playbook where at least, elected officials, public servants, even if they were attempting to advance a point of view and might shade the truth a little bit, wouldn't come on in a hearing or on even television and just flat out lie and tell you 2 + 2 = 700. Whereas so many of this administration, so many of the figures that populate it will do what Russ Vought did. I mean, it is a flat out lie, absurd, by the way, to say that 15 to 17 million Americans who are about to lose their health care are all illegal immigrants who are defrauding the system. No legitimate organization has found that. And I'm talking about right of center groups. I'm talking about Heritage and Manhattan Institute, talking about left of center groups, as well as nonpartisan ones. I mean, the official Congressional Budget Office, whose job it is to call the balls and strikes, it happens to be headed by a Republican appointee, Phil Swagel. They do an outstanding job. They found more than 15 million Americans will lose their health care. So what Russ Vought was doing is, rather than justifying why they want to see 15 million Americans lose their health care, why they just believe government should be cut to the bare bones and Medicaid and Medicare, these programs shouldn't exist, Obamacare shouldn't exist, rather than be intellectually honest and defend that, they'll just say flat out, it's not true, fake news, and just lie their asses off.
Well, break down for us what Trump's budget proposal would mean for the American public, not just in terms of healthcare, but with all of the programs that
Yeah.
are covered and that would be cut.
Yeah, boy, that can take a time. Quite a time. So let me try to briefly hit the highlights. And we can't look at this year's budget in isolation. We have to look at it as part of a 2-year project, the bulk of which was the big beautiful bill. By the
Mhm.
way, remember that he used to always talk about, quote, the big beautiful bill. It is so deeply unpopular. He never even mentions it. And even this guy who I have to say, I will give the devil his due when it comes to marketing and branding. It's one of the few things he does well. Frankly, he is the most effective, most successful con man in American history. Even he stood up in public and said, oh, we need to rebrand this differently, and acknowledged how unpopular his tax bill is. So included in that are the deep healthcare cuts, about $1 trillion worth of healthcare cuts, mostly to Medicaid and to the Obamacare exchanges. All told, that's where you get 15 million Americans at least who are about to lose their healthcare once the full cuts come into effect. A lot of them will come into effect, by the way, this upcoming December, conveniently a month after the midterm election. That's no accident, by the way. But those aren't the only cuts. You also have the largest cuts to nutrition assistance programs in American history. That's part of the controversy right now over the Farm Bill. You also have cuts to all sorts of things: Head Start, student loan repayment programs. The list really goes on and on. It totals $1.5 trillion. And that helps pay in part for the more than $5 trillion worth of tax cuts, which are mostly skewed at the very top. So all told, if you're going to look at everything comprehensively, if you're just wondering, okay, what in the end of the day is the net effect for most American families, a governmental organization called the Joint Committee on Taxation, they did projections on the overall impact of the Trump budget and tax proposal or tax law. And what they found is the biggest benefit went to the top 10% of households. And for the bottom 30% of Americans, they are actually worse off as a result of this budget and tax law than they were before it was passed. And that's really different from the Trump tax cuts of 8 years ago, or the George W. Bush tax cuts of 2001 or 2003. And those tax cuts actually everyone ended up benefiting a little bit. The benefits were more heavily skewed toward the top, but everyone did get something.
Mhm.
This is entirely different in a situation in which, again, if you're about the bottom 30%, bottom third of households, all of the cuts exceed the small benefit you may get in terms of the tax cut.
So between the tax bill, the war in Iran that has driven up gas prices, inflation on the rise, um, there is a huge affordability crisis for the American public. So far, the messaging out of the Trump administration has largely focused on that we need to build him a new ballroom in the White House. Can you talk to us about that? Because you've mentioned what a great salesperson that Donald Trump is, but how is he making the sale with the American public that he has the answers to this affordability crisis?
Look, the bottom line is life in America is too expensive right now.
Hmm.
And Trump and Republicans are making it worse. That started a year ago, actually, with his trade tariff taxes, which, let's be clear, there's no argument about this. A tariff is a type of tax the same way a mortgage is a type of loan. A tariff is a tax on any imported good, depending on the country or the product. His tariff taxes mean that we now have tariff taxes today higher than at any point since the Great Depression. They are costing the average American household almost $2,000 a year. So that, number one, has caused things to become more unaffordable. And you saw inflation, by the way, if you look at the 2025 data, inflation was coming down month over month for every single month of 2024, making real progress, headed back toward that 2% goal. And then what happened right around this time a year ago his so-called Liberation Day, he liberated high inflation because he brought it back. And that's when the spike up in the inflation charts begin. And it continues to this day. He then, of course, had the tax bill that I've been talking about with all of those healthcare cuts and other cuts, which also adds to the affordability problem and makes things more difficult for American families. And then finally, that brings you to this year, the completely unnecessary war with Iran, a war of choice. 2 months ago, the average for a gallon of gas nationwide was just under $3 a gallon. It is now, as of this morning, $4.30 a gallon. Last month was the single biggest monthly increase in gas prices since the 1960s. So it is clear that Trump just does not care about the affordability issue. He only cared about it insofar as it would help him get elected. Since he's become president, he has spent the bulk of his time on building his big, beautiful ballroom, on trying to build a golden arch over by Arlington National Cemetery, by attempting to, and so far succeeding to, etch his name on the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, which was the living memorial to an assassinated president. And the list goes on and on. He just cares. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the FIFA World Peace Prize, that very prestigious, long-ranging award that was just created this year to give to Trump. It reminds me, my daughter's 12 now, but when she was 3 years old, we would try to come up with, oh, here's this special toy and here's this thing. I take her to McDonald's and get her a Happy Meal, make a big deal out of the toy. And you'd pacify your kid, especially if they were in a bad mood or crying, and you'd make up a little fake thing and they'd be very excited about it. That's actually what FIFA did. And so many in industry are doing, giving the president fake awards because he's like a child and needs to be pacified. So I laugh rather than cry because it's just easier. The reality is this is a president who only cares about himself and just couldn't care less about making things more affordable for American families.
We're coming up on the 60-day timeline for the War Powers Act since Donald Trump launched his war with Iran. Are we, with the shifting votes in the House, do you expect to see action to hold this president accountable on the War Powers Act this week?
So Democratic members have both in the House and Senate, have repeatedly been pushing for this vote. We've actually had the vote a couple of times. Most recently here in the House, it's an effort led by Greg Meeks, who is the senior Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And unfortunately, his effort failed by a couple votes on the House floor. 99%, or despite all the rhetoric, about 99% of House Republicans have stuck with this president, even though the war in Iran is deeply unpopular, roughly by about a 25-point margin. The average of the polls I've seen have pretty much been around 35% approve, 60% disapprove, with a few percentage points undecided. And that's pretty consistent, again, as an average of all the polls I've seen, which is truly ahistorical, because almost all military efforts, whether they were wars or limited strikes, almost all of them were popular at the outset, even if they would go on to become unpopular, such as in Korea or Vietnam or the Iraq War of 20 years ago. So it is, again, another instance in which the American people are smart, overwhelmingly oppose this military operation. House Republicans, even those ones in vulnerable seats, know that, but they are so afraid to break with dear leader. They're more afraid of a mean tweet from the president than actually sticking with the bulk of their voters.
Talk to us about the FISA Act and how Mike Johnson is running into problems with his own caucus on this vote.
Yeah, I mentioned that we're now in this holding pattern, seeing what's going to happen next, because of two reasons. One was about finally allowing us to vote on the bill that would end the DHS shutdown for the most part. the bill that came over from the Senate unanimously 4 weeks ago. The other thing that is keeping us here attempting to figure out what Mike Johnson decides to do next, as he is attempting to figure that out himself. The other issue is FISA and the extension. We're up against the deadline, and this is an issue. It's not a black and white issue. I mean, I have supported FISA in the past. I have to say, however, there need to be real guidelines and guardrails around it, especially on the issue of warrants. As this administration has shown time and again, they cannot be trusted with special powers and enhanced powers. Now, to be clear, FISA has repeatedly enabled us to thwart possible terrorist attacks on our homeland ever since 9/11. So it has done very good things, and we should be aware of that. At the same time, the potential for abuse is absolutely there. So that's why a number of us are really, in a good faith way, attempting to get at the right reasonable position in which we can have the benefits of ensuring that we're protecting our country against any possible terrorist attack, yet at the same time not trampling over the civil liberties of Americans. Unfortunately, the Republicans here in the House have just had no interest whatsoever in attempting to strike that reasonable middle ground. So it looks like we're going to look at another 15-day, 30-day short-term extension just to enable us to continue working on that. Unfortunately, if we have a breakthrough, I think it's probably going to come from the Senate, because we go back to this dynamic. Mike Johnson cares more about just remaining leader within his conference and not being toppled from within.
Congressman, we had a really consequential decision come out of the Supreme Court this week with the Louisiana versus Calais decision on the Voting Rights Act, where the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision essentially gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act that will have massive reverberations in terms of representation, especially in southern states. Can you talk with us about the impact of this decision, and what are some of the discussions that you and your colleagues are having about what you can do to better protect voting rights?
You know, it is remarkable that we're even having this conversation. The Voting Rights Act was not controversial by the time you got to the 80s, the 90s, the aughts. I believe actually 20 years ago, it passed. It was reauthorized unanimously. Unfortunately, we're in a different era now, a very different Republican Party, a magnified Republican Party that goes after anything that promotes equality on terms of race and ethnicity. This is one more effort by this Supreme Court to dismantle the VRA. In terms, though, of the practical implication, I'm not an attorney, I have quickly been, over the last 24 hours, reading different analysis pieces from sources I respect. And I think there is from what I observe, a diversity of opinion in terms of what the ramifications of this will be. Essentially, how bad will this be? I don't think anyone on my side thinks this was a positive ruling, just to be clear. But the court actually didn't quite go as far as they could have gone, and I think as far as Alito and Clarence Thomas wanted them to go. Now, I'm not naive. I think you will see a number of, especially Republican, MAGA-dominated state legislatures really attempt to push the envelope now, and then there'll be more litigation over this. Final point I'll make on it, Supreme Court, or at least Roberts and Kavanaugh, seem to be somewhat schizophrenic on this issue, because just 2 years ago, in the Milliken case, they actually ruled in such a way that enabled a second African-American majority seat, or at least second African-American plurality seat, to be created in in Louisiana, as well as Alabama. And we have now 2 additional seats, both happen to be African-American Democrats, out of those states as a result of the Milliken decision, in which Roberts and Kavanaugh joined the majority. And yet here we are, not that much longer after that decision, And we seem to have at least somewhat of a reversal. So, more than anything, I think the court has really muddled this situation.
Congressman Boyle, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us as well.